Welcome back to Scotty's Clock World. I upload new clock repair videos on Sunday and Wednesday mornings of every week. Alright, we're ready to start polishing our first pivot now. There's our wheel, and there's the pivot we're going to polish. Now the first thing we have to do is we have to see what condition the pivot is in. I'll do both ends of these. Now how you discover how bad a condition the pivot is in is you run your fingernail along the pivot like so, and if there's a groove in it you will pick it up very quickly. It's a very efficient method of finding a groove in your pivot. I'll do the other end. Turn the wheel round, try it again, once again. No, there's no grooves in those pivots. They'll be very easy to polish. That's the wheel that we're going to polish the pivot on. So we're going to do the polishing on this lathe today. So to hold the wheel firmly in the 3-jaw chuck, we use a pin vise. Slide the arbor in and tighten the chuck down on the pin vise. Then put it in to the 3-jaw chuck on your metal lathe and tighten the jaws down. Not too strong, but just enough to hold the pin vise and the wheel securely. Turn it on. That doesn't look too bad. I'll turn the machine off. Now the first thing we have to do is we bring in a dead center and align it just away from the pivot so it doesn't catch. We don't want it to touch. Then turn the lathe on. Then have a look to see if there's any movement up and down in the pivot. And that one looks pretty good actually. So we use the lathe on low speed. And the first tool we're going to use is an India stone, a very fine India stone. We put that down underneath the pivot, align it so it's square, and then using minimal pressure, bring it up into contact with the pivot. Move it up and down, working with and against the rotation of the pivot in the lathe, and it won't take long before you can see the pivot is starting to become more shiny. This is a slow process because you're removing as little metal as possible. You are just removing any high spots from the pivot. That feels pretty good. Right. Now, the second tool we're going to use is the gusset stone. It's a synthetic ruby stone. It's very fine. And we do the same again. Align it under the pivot so that it's square. And then very slowly move it up and down. And it takes very little time to polish a pivot. Bearing in mind we're not trying to remove material from the pivot, we're just trying to remove any high spots. In this instance, if we had grooves or a groove in the pivot, we'd be using a pivot file to remove that first before we went through this polishing process. Alright, that's looking pretty good. In this section I will show you how to polish a pivot if it has a groove running around it. Now if we have a pinion that has a definite groove in it, which I'm feeling for with my thumbnail, and there it is. You can see my thumbnail jump as it falls in and out of that line. It's worn there. It has a serious wear line right there. Alright, this is quite a different operation from the last one. First up, we'll put it into a pin vise once again, the wheel, tighten that up, and then put the pin vise into the 3-jaw chuck. Make sure that's tight. Put it on, check and see how it rotates. Tighten that down. That's not too bad, you can see that. There's no bend in the pivot there. Take the dead center back. Now what we use this time is one of these tools, a pivot file. It has a very fine file for pivot work on one end. That side and that side are smooth, so that when you're using it, you're not cutting into the end of a lantern pinion or a wheel or anything else that's there. And then the other end is used for burnishing. Also 2 blank sides. Put a cap on that. So what we're going to do is, it's a similar process to using the stones. Start up the lathe. I'll turn it up a little bit higher. It's about 300 revs. And once again, align the file with the pivot. Move it backwards and forwards and up and down. We don't want to take very much material off, we just want to remove that line that's on there. Taking it nice and carefully. I'll check for our line, see how we're going. Yep, still a little bit there, a bit more. Bearing in mind while we're doing this, we are removing some material from the pivot, so the plate's going to have to be rebushed with a slightly smaller hole in it. To fit the reworked pivot. It feels right, I'll spin that round, check that. Yep, that feels right. Alright, now turn the lathe on. India stone first up. Light pressure. Run it up and down the pivot. Sideways a little bit. Check and see. Yeah, that feels pretty good. I'll do a little bit more with the India stone. Now the degusset stone. Slowly moving it up and down, a little bit of pressure, not very much. Sideways a little bit. At this stage you should feel the pivot's very smooth. You lost that little bit of a catch that was there when we were using the pivot file. Right, now the burnisher. Same as before, move it up and down slowly, light pressure. Burnisher is putting a final polish on. It's also work hardening the material so that the pivot will be a little bit harder and will not damage quite so easily. Plus, this gives it a mirror finish, a glass finish, which is what we're looking for on all our pivots. A little bit more, it's a little bit dull on the end there, so I'll move it backwards and forwards a little bit. Right, turn the lathe off. Take the pin vise out. and have a look and see what we've got. I'll take my glove off so I can test, and then align your fingernail on the pivot, spin the pin vise around your hand, and then you can then test to see if that line has gone. And it has, and the pivot is looking very shiny. That's the two ways that you can polish a pivot: if it's got a groove in it, or if it's not too bad. There is a third way, and it's a way that is very handy if you haven't got the gussets, stones, etc. If you only want to remove the high points on your pivot, you haven't got a groove in it, then you can use one of these cool little machines. A popsicle stick cut in half with a little bit of sticky tape on it to act as the hinge, covered in 2000 grit wet and dry sandpaper. And what you do then is you align the pivot in between both halves and spin the pin vise backwards and forwards. Move it up a little bit further and spin it round again. And this does almost as good a job as the job on the lathe. If you haven't got a lathe, that's the way to do it. Once again, you can see how shiny the pivot is. So if you haven't got a lathe, you still can't get out of polishing your pivots, because all it requires a little bit of 2000 grit sandpaper, wet and dry, and a popsicle stick, and a little bit of sticky tape. Cut the popsicle stick in half, join it up with the sticky tape, glue the 2000 grit on. When it's finished, run round it with a pair of scissors or a sharp blade, square it up, get rid of the rough ends, and you're ready to roll. Easy as that. If you find this video helpful, please leave a like and don't forget to subscribe.